If you're pissed off at the government, should you riot and break stuff? Let's talk about it. Yes, this is on the heels of the crazy stuff happening in Australia right now, which is also known as the former and current prison colony, where a whole lot of people have been objecting to the police state they've been living in and have been taken to the streets and just wrecking stuff and getting in all kinds of fights with the police. So, should you riot if you're pissed off at your government? It's a little bit more of a nuanced answer, of course. So let's start out with like the very moral basis of all this kind of stuff, of non-aggression and stuff. So, if no one's trying to hurt you, you shouldn't hurt them. That's very basic, right? Of course, we live in this weird situation with government where there's a whole lot of people who aren't really trying to hurt you most of the time. But if you do what they don't want you to do, there's some kind of eventual harm and death down that trajectory, right? If you don't pay your taxes, some people with guns will come and throw you in jail. And if you resist too much, they'll shoot you. And there you go. I mean, so we're in this awkward situation where at the same time, we're, I guess, morally justified against any kind of attacks against, or defensive maneuvers, depending on your perspective, against government. At the same time, we don't. Almost every single libertarian, anarchist, whatever, who just does not believe in government as a moral institution and talks about this whole taxation is theft thing and, you know, voting is violence and whatever else, they're just perfectly happy to go about their days and not attack agents of the state ever. Just never do it. So what gives with that? There's a lot of practicality to that. And it's, first off, the threat of violence is not immediate, right? There's some steps before you hit there. And so I think a lot of people just don't feel, you know, right in doing anything about it, because it's like, well, they're allowed to mostly live kind of free if they don't, you know. And so it's like the violence doesn't kick in until later. And the bigger thing, though, is that there's a societal acceptance, which a lot of people, you know, it's uncomfortable truth, but it's kind of there. A lot of people believe the government has legitimate authority, even though I'm not one of those people. And so if you were to just say, like, I'm not pulling over, oh, I'm going to shoot the cop as he gets out, yeah, well, he did force against malfeasance, like, no one's going to be behind that. You just can't get away with that at all. And so it's a more of a practical kind of a thing than it is a moral thing. I mean, think about the opposite, though, which is kind of interesting. Imagine any of our government interactions on a daily basis, any of the kind of stuff they do. Imagine if someone did that in a world without government. All of a sudden, some guy puts on flashing lights on his car and like runs you off the road. And you're like, well, what's going on, dude? And they're like, you're going too fast. And I'm like, so, like, I think I was going fine. And the guy's like, well, I'm going to need you to step out. You're going to say, I'm going to need you to step away. And if there's a violent confrontation from there, it's perfectly justified. And all society's like, who's this random guy who's running you off the road and yelling at you and wants your money because he doesn't like the way you've been driving? If you punch him in the face, it's like, he had it coming, like that was deserved. But in today's world, it's like, well, a bunch of his guys are going to come kick your ass now. And a lot of people will just stand by because they're like, yeah, you're kind of not justified in doing that, even though, you know, you kind of are. And even a lot of hardcore anarchist type people will sort of not support you at that point. Not necessarily morally, but more like, that guy was stupid. So should you riot? First off, the basis of violence against state actors, it seems to be, even though at our root cause, anyone who visits violence against us should expect us to be able to retaliate with equal or whatever necessary force in order to stop that from happening. Well, that's at the root. We've all sort of collectively, including libertarians, I have to point this out, which, you know, annoys a lot of people. We've all collectively come to this sort of gentleman's agreement of like, yeah, it's wrong, but we're going to try to like find other ways of making them go away unless it gets really bad. So if there's something like an anti-nudity law or some kind of thing going on, and you just start rioting in the streets and just hitting, you know, flipping over cops, like, a lot of people will think that's absolutely not acceptable at all. Just like this minor little regulation here, and you're just ripping everything up. Even Libertarians will probably say, even though the root they acknowledge that it's your right to resist against whatever, they'll probably just say, what the hell? No, this is not how we do it. Wait till it gets bad. So we go back to the Australia type example. To much of the world, it's gotten bad there, right? It's gotten bad enough to warrant that kind of a thing. And if, for example, you have people locking you in your own homes, patrolling the streets, not letting you outside of the house, busting you with like a KFC order, although that was New Zealand, if I remember correctly. But still, if all this stuff is happening and a bunch of you just turn out to the streets and say, we're not going to take it anymore, and if you try to break us up and say you have to be back in your homes, we're going to fight back physically. That's something that everyone kind of seems to agree is like, okay. Again, everyone among the libertarians, I guess, or most people, and a lot of non-libertarians as well. Like, just a lot of people see, yeah, that's too far. That's kind of appropriate. It seems like the scale based on where we're at is kind of a lot of the yardstick that people are willing to use. So, for example, a lot of these oppressions are just, first off, so bad. It's not just minor or mid-level restrictions to your freedom at threat of violence. It's big ones. And so at that point, it's like, okay, it's worth it. But also, it seems to be the departure from the mainstream, right? The status quo is this much oppression. If you oppress so much more, then okay, now it's worthwhile. Whereas if you're not oppressed at all, and then they want to visit the current amount of oppression that all of us live under, that would also be okay, but not if you want to like do it now. It's just everyone's kind of gotten used to it. So that's all is a right or not. So morally, if you don't believe in government, yes. But then to a certain extent of like generally accepted norms and stuff, even those people would not say it's the right thing to do to just, visit violence on someone who's, implicitly threatening violence against you. That's just very normal and benign. It has to be something dramatic before people really universally have sympathy. Of course, if you riot, then there's the property damage and not the taxpayer stuff or whatever. It's not the government. It's bystanders. Of course, if you do anything, there's always a risk of, bystander injury. So if someone is trying to hurt you and you fight back and an errant blow knock over a bystander, is that an immoral thing to do? I mean, it's not right. No, that person didn't hurt you. This person did. You're fighting against them. Does that mean that you can't fight back if there's a risk? Also, probably not. That just means that you accept the possibility that bystanders will be harmed and you accept the responsibility that's on you. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people in, libertarian cultures have a very childish view of morality, whereas this is right, this is not right. These are the rules, these are not. Even though there's no rules, these are the rules, and these are not. I do this is good. I do that is bad. I cannot do this. There's a lot of gray area in the real world. But more importantly, on top of that, it's responsibility. It's you do this, you're fine. You do that, you accept responsibility for the consequences of your actions. That doesn't mean you can yes, you can't no. It just means, are you willing to piss off people by doing this? Are you willing to accidentally hurt somebody and then they might come against you or whatever? Or are you willing to accept the consequences of your actions? If not, then don't do it. If yes, do it. And then that is what it is. And of course, finally, should you riot? Is it a good idea? And they say that riots are the language of the oppressed or something like that, which there's a lot of different languages of the oppressed. But the other thing is it even a good idea to go about this? Are you going to actually have a positive effect? Of course, that is something to take into consideration, especially when you start to think about, collateral damage and risk to yourself, of course. So should you riot if you're pissed off with the government? First off, you're allowed to kind of, according to the basic, non-aggression principle, you're kind of allowed to now, but everyone's sort of accepted that since this has been sort of tolerated by society as a whole for the most part for long enough, it's kind of not okay, even though it is, to really just do it. Unless there's dramatic circumstances like a giant nationwide prison state like lockdown. It's just not for oh, you want to get out of a traffic ticket, therefore you're going to riot. People aren't going to accept that. So is it right? There you go. What about innocent bystanders? Well, you're not supposed to hurt them, but realistically, something could happen if you did riot. And really, it's on you to take responsibility for that consequence. Not just, well, can you or can't you, and then you're safe. You're never safe. Always take responsibility for actions. And finally, you got to think, is this going to work? Is this going to be worth everything? Is this going to be worth, all the damage and all the other stuff to not just myself, but other people around it? And if the answer is yes, then, go for it, kind of. I don't know. Again, I'm not advocating for anyone to riot. I'm not saying anyone can't riot. I'm not saying what is moral and what isn't. I'm just talking. Just getting you thinking. Hopefully you think, right?